Welcome to the third session of Postgres Pulse. It's our third Monday here where we're all together to talk about Postgres issues and answer Postgres questions that we see on Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange, and in our own support organization. Just like the last 3 weeks, I have with me Josh Heyer, our developer advocate, Bruce Momjian, obviously Postgres evangelist and co-founder of the Postgres community, and Vibor Kumar, chief performance architect from Enterprise DB. Before we dive into the details, just want to remind everybody of the guidelines. Please use the Q&A button to ask questions, and please ask questions. That's what we're here for. Stay muted unless you're talking. The moderator will unmute question askers so that that they can add a little bit more color to their question. And then last but certainly not least, maybe most important, is please be civil and abide by the Postgres Code of Conduct. Today we will talk about LDAP and centralized authentication schemes. There were a number of questions that we have seen on Stack Overflow and Stack Exchange. So that's going to be the key topic today. So please, if you have questions about that specific topic, LDAP and other centralized authentication schemes for Postgres, please put them into the chat box. Also, if you have others subjects that you'd like to recommend that we pick up on one of the coming Mondays, please, that's also a good place to put them. So now the first thing we're going to do is Bruce is going to give us a quick update on what's been happening in the Postgres community in the last couple of weeks. Bruce? Great.
So we did have the Postgres 13 commit fest end on I believe it was beginning of April. April 8 was what we call the feature freeze, where we closed the commit fest, and we effectively are in a state where we're not expecting any new patches or any new major, any new features to be coming in. It's all cleanup mode at this point. There is one really interesting feature that's kind of hanging out there related to scalability for very high connection counts. Mark and I have sort of studied that. I have a hope that's going to still be kind of slid in, but that's a controversial subject, and we're still discussing how much leeway we give, how much was the virus responsible, how much was the bugs that he found in other parts of the code while he was researching it responsible for the delay. Anyway, that's kind of the one thing I think that's significant kind of hanging around. I personally am waiting for the time when the code base stabilizes, so I can spend a glorious 10 days writing the major release notes. We are expecting the beta to be out in late May. Of course, the first commit fest for Postgres 14 will be in July, and then we start this whole thing all over again. Obviously, our July events are still actually scheduled to happen, so there is some hope there that travel will resume and that we'll be able to continue with those. We have a lot of good discussion going on. Again, really haven't skipped a beat in terms of what we're doing. We are monitoring to make sure everyone's healthy and staying safe, and we haven't had any major issues there. So we can be very thankful for that.
Great. Thanks for the update, Bruce. And I must say, I'm personally very, very excited about the potential to get that new connection patch in to drive number of concurrent connections up significantly, especially in, I guess, read-only environments. I think that would be very, very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, a small part of that patch did make it in, but there's a larger part that's a little more major, and I think Andres Food is still working on that patch to kind of get it to final, and I'm hoping he's going to show up with something to say, yes, this is ready. And then we can look at it and maybe get enough eyeballs on it where we're comfortable to get it in. But he did get part of it in already, but the rest of it, I'm hoping, we can kind of slip in there. We don't want to set a bad precedent for future cases, but I think in this case, it's wise to I'm certainly in favor of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Okay, so let's dive into today's LDAP and other centralized authentication mechanisms. Bruce, if you can maybe start with giving us a generalized background of, is LDAP one of a kind, or are there multiple ways, and why does LDAP pop up so often?
Yeah, I having been with the project for so long, you think, oh, he understands all the pieces that go around, and I have to admit, the authentication thing has always baffled me, certain parts of it, because we do support, I believe it's 14 or 11 different types of authentication, and every time I kind of look at it, I'm like, oh, do we need to support that many types of authentication? But the bottom line is that you have to support whatever authentication somebody's potentially going to be using in their infrastructure. So whether that's Active Directory, Radius, certificate authentication, passwords, Kerberos, whatever, you've got to, you sort of, yeah, you have to come to the party, properly dressed, as they say. So we have had we do have a huge number of options. Some of them are very complicated, particularly Kerberos has its own infrastructure that goes with it. And I've kind of been sort of not clear on this. So I did spend the past, 4 days or Easter weekend kind of digging through a lot of that and kind of trying to understand how all the pieces fit together. LDAP is an interesting one. It's kind of an outlier in terms of the authentication methods we use, because it really doesn't describe the authentication from the client to the database server. What it really describes is when a password arrives from the client, what do I do with it? So unlike almost all the other ones where the authentication method really describes what to do with it, what LDAP does is says password has arrived from the client. It has to arrive unencrypted, unhashed, because we're going to then send that using an LDAP protocol. LDAP is not a product, it's a protocol. We're going to use that LDAP protocol to communicate to another server, which has a centralized authentication registry. That centralized authentication registry could be Active Directory, as I said before, but it also could be OpenLDAP, which is a piece of software that effectively implements the LDAP protocol to allow you to communicate between Postgres and that OpenLDAP server. So that's why it's kind of an outlier. Almost all the other ones, Kerberos and GS and SASL and Scram, and they're all defining protocols. LDAP is not doing that. It's merely saying when this thing arrives, what protocol do I use after the password arrives to validate it? And again, if you're doing central registry, where you've got an organization that has a central registry and you want Postgres to communicate to that, you really only have like 3 choices, right? Central registry, it's either going to be Kerberos, it's going to be Open LDAP, or it's going to be Active Directory. I don't think there's any other, or Radius. I'm sorry, Radius is another one that does central sort of directory mechanisms.
Okay, thank you. And Vibhor, from your point of view, I know you've implemented LDAP authentication numerous times, right? And I know that this is not without its challenges, especially if you want to maintain performance, etc. Any color you want to add to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, as Bruce mentioned that people try to use LDAP servers for managing their user. There are many advantages too, because you have a central way of managing all the users and the passwords. You can implement your company-wide security policy on the passwords and authentication. You can do all those things. But this also comes with some challenges. Challenges in the sense, for example, if you have many Postgres servers and you have an LDAP authentication implemented for each Postgres service, right? So if users are connecting to a database, then Postgres will be rerouting that authentication to LDAP server, which creates a lot of load on the LDAP server, plus also load on the network too. And of course can also result into slowness on making a connection to the database. So when we look at all these aspects, right? If your network is fast, yes, and if you have few users connecting to your database and making connection to the LDAP server and the load on the LDAP server is not very high, it's very good. But when it comes with with supporting many Postgres instances, like if you have a kind of a Postgres service platform created in your environment, or if you if you're trying to use any other cloud to create Postgres as a platform, and for those authentication you want to use a LDAP server, it may create a lot of load on the system. And that's why when we look at it, when we look at those performance issues, we always try to come up with a better solution. Like most of the companies, they use PAM plus triple SD. Triple SD is a way to cache those credentials for a while, and it expires those and reduce the load on the LDAP server side. This gives you benefit from the authenticating a user quickly. Plus, it also reduces the connection time, to the Postgres database, because now Postgres is using connecting to the PAM. PAM is actually checking with the SSD whether it has a cache credential or not. If it doesn't have, just go and connect to the LDAP, get the credentials, confirm it, and allow the connection to the database. So this is the kind of mechanism which most of the people use it. So yeah, you have to be very, very mindful when you use LDAP or direct authentication from the Postgres to the central server.
That's very good input. Thank you. Thanks. And also our blog that accompanies today's session, Josh, if you can just maybe just post a link. It talks quite a bit about some of the issues with LDAP, especially in that case, overlapping organizational units and what happens when people get moved around between these organizational units. So that's also, I think, pretty interesting. Again, a reminder for everybody, if you have questions about LDAP, if you have things that you would like Josh, Bruce, or Vibor to address, put it into the Q&A. Okay, so let's jump on to the first question that Josh, you found on Stack Overflow, if you don't mind.
Sure. Let me share my screen here so y'all got something to look at. And I'll drop... drop the link there. All right. So here's here's a person asking about setting up Postgres authentication with line encryption. This is a good idea, right? I mean, you don't want to be sending all your credentials, all your communication in plain text over the wire, even if it's in your internal network. But he tries to turn it on and nothing happens. He gets an error. It definitely isn't working for him. So he's asking what he's forgetting, and we got an answer here from our own Richie N, kind of suggesting some ideas there. But anybody want to kind of give a little bit more background on why this occurs, or why this would trip you up just trying to turn it on?
Yeah, so Bruce, I mean, you mentioned before that the password has to arrive from the client to the server unhashed, right? How does this question tie in with the fact that it has to arrive unhashed?
Well, boy, you know, I don't want to sit here and sort of disparage LDAP, but I started thinking about how this whole thing is sort of set up. And of course, you're right. If you're sending the password unencrypted across the wire, because from the client to the database server, you have to use SSL, because obviously, if not, then your password is available in the free. But you also have to use certificates, and you have to have those certificates verified, because effectively, if you don't do that, somebody in the middle could intercept the packet, pretend to be the server, read the password, and then pass it on to the database server, right? So, I would almost say by definition, even if you're using LDAP, you're going to have to create certificates on the client, and you're going to have it signed by the same certificate authority as the server is, so that you can do verify. You can have the certificate verification both, from the client going into the server, and then you can also turn it on the other way. And then you've got to also do the same step from the database server to the LDAP server, right? So it's kind of like you have to create, I think, to do this properly, you have to create the certificate authorities, and you have to have it verifying the whole way. And by the time you've done all that, it's pretty complicated. Then you start getting into using LDAP. So that's kind of the challenge here.
Okay. So Vibor, from your point of view, technically making this work, I mean, what are the challenges? What are the guidance that you can give somebody who's struggling with this?
So I'm not sure exactly which version of the PostgreSQL person is using, because in version Postgres 11, we started supporting the LDAPs. So if you look at all the organizations, they believe that they can use LDAPs way of creating an encryption or encrypted communication between Postgres and the LDAP server, right? And that's why they use LDAP's protocol. They don't really use the TLS-based certificate where Postgres connects to the LDAP server and creates a one encrypted communication to send the password to LDAP server and get the response from the LDAP server. So that if you are using a little old version of the LDAP and your organization supports only LDAP's protocol for communication between Postgres or from any other third-party application or application to LDAP server, then in that case, it may not work properly. Because in old version, Postgres used to support LDAP with TLS. And that's why you need to have a TLS certificates available, or TLS should be enabled on the LDAP server side. And that is a problem which I can see here. And of course, when you enable the TLS, you need to mention the LDAP port too, because TLS communication happens only on a specific port. So if you missed out the port number, and if you missed to enable the LDAP TLS equals to 1, then the communication will not happen properly, and the LDAP server will reject the connection from the Postgres side.
I see.
And I think that's what Richard Yan has recommended here. He mentioned that you should use LDAP TLS equals to 1, and you should mention the port number. LDAP port equals to 389, on which you can, LDAP allows a connection, TLS communications.
Okay, good. And I see that Richard also makes reference to a blog he wrote, well, 2 years ago about having Postgres talk to LDAP with StartTLS, correct? And
Correct.
I think this post specifically is about Postgres 10. That's what the tag says. So, okay, good. Josh, I know you had another similar.
Yeah, let's jump over to this one here, because I think this ties in a little bit with some of what we discussed earlier about
multiple OUs. Yeah.
Yeah. So trying to set up and want people from different areas of the organization to be able to log into the database. This is maybe not exactly obvious when you're staring at an example config file. So once again, Richie jumps in and kind of lays out a better example of how to do this and how you got to set it up. And this ties in, I think, a bit to what you were saying earlier, Bruce, about having to kind of have everything, all your ducks in a row before you can actually use LDAP to.
Yeah, it's a pretty complicated setup. StartTLS makes it a little easier because with StartTLS, you can use the same port number for both TLS and non-TLS connections. But if you're using straight TLS, you have to use a dedicated port number, and that can be a little bit of a configuration issue. By the time this is all done, you're like, well, if I'm already having to create the certificates on the client and so forth, what am I actually getting out of LDAP, authentication, right? I mean, it's kind of it's sort of like, it would be great if we could just do LDAP and not have to deal with certificates and say LDAP is our thing, but I don't think that's really a secure option. So you kind of have to do certificates and then walk into the LDAP part. And the LDAP part at that point, it's giving you certainly authentication in terms of a password. You've already authenticated the client because the certificate's there, but it's giving you user management effectively and rights management, in a centralized location.
Now, I got a little question here, because honestly, you mentioned this a couple of times now. It sounds horrifically, not complex, well, that too, but just a tremendous amount of work. If I have another option, if I'm on Active Directory, why would I ever go with LDAP instead of just using GSS API or Kerberos?
So that's a great question. One of the nice things about Kerberos, as far as I understand, is that when you log in a single sign-on method, and I think Kerberos is really our only sort of single sign-on option, as far as I know, for Postgres. You get a ticket, the ticket has a timestamp in it, it's encrypted. You send that ticket across the wire to the database server. The database server, as far as I know, can decrypt the ticket, look at the timestamp, verify the ticket, and it doesn't really need to connect to the Kerberos key server to verify that. I'm pretty sure that's the case. So therefore, you don't have the requirement that the database server has to be communicating to an LDAP server all the time, right? Although again, if you're using Active Directory, it is still going to communicate to the LDAP server, the Active Directory server, because it's got to verify the key, the user, and get the rights for it and so forth. So what Moore said still was validation. But even if we use Kerberos, you know, the modern way of using Kerberos still requires SSL. And if you're using SSL, unless you want to avoid man-in-the-middle attacks, you still have to use certificates. So technically the ticket that you send across the wire is not something that somebody can read because it's encrypted, unlike what we have to do with LDAP, but that ticket can still be reused by someone else during the period at which it's valid. So the modern architecture recommendations, even if you're using Kerberos, which was technically designed for non-encrypted networks, is to use an encrypted connection. So when you use GSS, which is Kerberos, you have the option in Postgres, I believe 11 or 10, to encrypt using GSS, the entire communication channel. So there it's a little more unified, but again, you're still not, what I don't remember is how well I believe the GSS does not have a problem with man-in-the-middle attacks, but I am not sure about that. Because I don't remember how GSS does the encryption. It's different than SSL in some ways. So perhaps with GLS, you don't need to use GSS, and Kerberos, you don't need to use the certificates. I don't know the answer to that.
So before I ask Vibor to chime into this topic, remind everybody, if you have questions, if you have things that you'd like to know about this topic, or suggest topics for upcoming weeks, put them into the Q&A, please. So Vibor, from your point of view, I know you've implemented LDAP and Active Directory. Any guidance if somebody's looking at a greenfield?
Yeah, I mean, Active Directory, I mean, again, it's the old way of doing the things. Microsoft was a popular technology. In that time, people were just trying to manage users using the Active Directory. And as the technology is moving forward and new technologies coming in the picture, LDAP was also a very old one. So Active Directory does support LDAP protocol. So it means you can use Postgres LDAP protocol, LDAP authentication to connect with the Active Directory and authenticate a user. Now people are actually migrating away from the Active Directory because of many other reasons. One is that they want to have a cloud-based solution, centralized solution, easy to configure, more secure. Active Directory provides that, but people are now looking for the more modern technology. And that's why there are other companies came in the picture, like Okta, Auth0. They are bridging the gap of migrating people away from the Active Directory. But you can definitely use it. I think the main concern was a complexity about configuring Postgres authentication with the LDAP server. It's not really very complex. If you are the Active Directory user and you have an active admin, they know how to enable the LDAP protocol. They can allow Postgres to authenticate a user through Active Directory, and you'll be good to go. It's only about using the right tool sets or scripting the whole mechanism so that you can configure Postgres to authenticate user against Active Directory. And as Bruce mentioned that, right, people can use GSS API, which is again a new feature in the Postgres. This authentication mechanism is very secure, plus very, very popular among developers too, because you can think about the GSS API creates a standard API for authentication. So right now it's support only for the Kerberos, but over the period, people have open source community. People have developed multiple, I would say, protocols for LDAP server 2. So even if you are using GSS API, you can authenticate users through the LDAP servers. GSS API by itself doesn't do much. It just only define the standard APIs or which you can leverage in your application. And the same way we are leveraging in the Postgres.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So I think we had a third question that is actually tying to the certificates, which I think has been a recurring topic here, the use of the certificates and you know, what the challenges are with those. So Josh, you want to walk us through that? We have
Well,
a few minutes left.
as Vibor just said, you know, this isn't that complex if you know what you're doing, right? So here's how you can make it complex. No, so this is not, I don't think an uncommon desire. You're setting up a test environment. You're setting up a local internal network. You want to just generate a cert and have it working. You don't want to go through, you know, an external authority to get this all set up. Maybe you're just setting up a dev workstation or a lab, whatever. Point is, you want to just be able to spit out that cert and get this stuff working. And of course, you know, our author here is trying this and finding that it very much doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of those fundamental questions where Bruce, and maybe you can address the role of the certificate and who do you actually trust, right? Which is, I think, behind this problem here, right?
Yeah, the issue, and I do have a slide presentation that talks about, it's called, you know, security, talk about how to set Postgres up securely. And a lot of people, when they start with SSL, say, okay, I want to encrypt end to end, right? And I've got, you know, Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and then maybe I'm using certificate maybe to verify the host name on the other end and so forth. But effectively, anybody, as you can see from this blog entry, can create a certificate with any name on it they want, right? I mean, we have instructions even in the Postgres manual of how to create a self-signed certificate. So I can be whitehouse.gov or I can be nsa.gov, whatever. And I can create as many certificates as I want. What makes a certificate actually trustworthy is that the inside the certificate is a signature from another certificate authority who I also am indicated that I've trust. So when you go to a browser, that little lock in the corner doesn't indicate the other side has a certificate. It indicates the other side is a certificate that is either signed by a certificate authority that I trust or is signed by an intermediate whose intermediate certificate is signed by somebody I trust. When you're trying to set up a test environment, effectively, you almost have to create your own fake certificate authority, okay? And have that fake self-signed certificate authority. Every certificate authority in the world, you know, whether it's GoDaddy or you know, RSA, whatever, they're all self-signed, right? But they're trusted, and then they sign other certificates, which effectively sign other certificates. So if you're going to set up a test environment, you almost have to create a certificate authority, which is self-signed, and then that certificate authority has to sign all of the people who are involved, all of the computers who are involved in trust within that test environment. And the only reason you have to do that, if you don't do that, you're not testing the trust capability within that environment.
Right.
Right. So what you don't want to do is say, oh, I'm just going to create some self-signed certificates, and I've never really set up my infrastructure to validate their certificates. And then all of a sudden I forget about that and I put it in production, right? And then bad things happen. So that's why if you're going to set up a test environment, it's very hard, for example, to say, I'm going to set up a test environment, but I want to use server X to do authentication, which is not in my test environment, because that's not going to work, because you're not going to have their certificate over there is not going to be signed by a certificate authority that you trust, and your other systems aren't going to be signed. What you can do is to create like a test intermediate certificate authority. That's what I would always recommend. Create an intermediate certificate authority, which you're using for testing, and then have that intermediate be signed by a certificate authority everyone trusts, and then you sign all of the test machines using new certificates signed by that test intermediate certificate,
Right.
then you can use them in a mixed environment.
So I think one of the key messages here is you don't actually trust the certificate. You trust the
person who signed it. Yeah. And by definition, if it's self-signed, you're not, there's nobody trusting it except yourself. That gets you the encryption part, but it doesn't get you the verification that the person on the other end is the same trust as the person who gave me my certificate. They're self-signed certificates are islands of trust, and they cannot really interact well unless they sign certificates underneath them. Two self-signed certificates have no trust between them at all because they're self-signed.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks. Those were interesting questions and discussions today about LDAP and LDAP in the greater context of having trust between a database server and a centralized authority. Next week, Monday, same time, we're going to talk about connection pooling. So again, if you have questions, comments, thoughts about that, send us a Postgres Pulse at Enterprise DB, or pop them into the Q&A right now. And otherwise, we'll see you again in a week. Thank you very much for joining us.